You never hear about the new immigration law. People getting Congress in America. So hear me now. The new law make all Bajans a fitter. The new law.
Yeah. This one here, the great sounds of Coca T. New immigration law. Big shout out to all those loving and feeling that one. We're now taking you to the great sounds and the great voice of Richard Rowe. Okay, he's joined us a few times now on the big bad station, arawakradio.com. Okay, with lots of different topics for discussion. And of course, he's going to introduce himself, spread the message, okay, and of course talk to us about a topic each and every time he comes on. So of course, Richard, you there?
I certainly am, thank you.
Nice to speak to you again. And of course, once again, introduce yourself for the listeners out there, and of what topic you're going to talk about today.
Okay, right. Well, I'm Richard Rowe. I'm ordinary white old English retired guy, was an accountant. Lived in Coventry for 50 years. All my family are white English, so I'm a pretty bog standard local person. In the last 6 years or so, I've done some work for a number of refugees and charities, and it's been a real education for me. And the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry wanted some stories from migrants. Because I was working with them, they said to me, do you want to come along and encourage the guys?
Yeah.
We did that. It never really got anywhere. So I made the lunatic step of writing a story myself, which I've never done in my life. And it's called Prisoners of Beliefs.
Yeah.
And what it looks at is what you believe and why do you believe it? And then what are the ramifications in terms of the life we lead today for the belief systems? Because you can find the same incident interpreted completely differently, dependent on what your past experiences are and what your belief system is to justify it.
Yeah.
So that's the background. Tonight, I'd like to talk about the belief systems that we have and the impact, and specifically, initially I'm going to focus on religion.
Okay.
It's a very broad subject, it's a very sensitive subject. Many people have very strong views about it.
Yeah.
But it is very important because it's central to the civilizations that we've had for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
The core, the story is actually about a black guy called Carl, escapes from Africa, comes to this country, and he applies for right to remain. He's not allowed to work. He sits in a room on his own, bored out of his skull, has no friends, no money, and his support worker says, "Why don't you go to the library?" So he then goes and he starts to study things like history and economics and politics, colonization, decolonization, many things, and he tries to understand why he is where he is. And so tonight, what I'm going to look at specifically is religion, and this is nothing to do with whether God exists, because he's unworldly, and you cannot prove that. You can't prove that he exists. You can't prove he doesn't exist.
Yeah.
What I'm looking at is what is the impact on the world today of the beliefs that we have.
Okay.
So I'm going to read some bits out of the story, and this is as Carl goes along and he investigates the facts, the historical facts, because his support worker says, Carl has looked at organisations, why people congregate together, how societies form, why they form, and the support worker says, well, there's one thing you've missed out, and he says that's religion. And Carl says, well, what's that got to do with organisations? Yeah. And Graham, his support worker, says everything. Said religions have all the characteristics that you're talking about, belief systems, shared values, rules, and leaders, and amongst the largest organisations in the world. As for conflict, think how many religious wars there have been around the world over thousands of years, many of them continuing today.
Yeah.
And he says, well, whilst you're at it, look at the history of how they were formed. Pardon me. So Carl then starts to study this. So the next day he goes to the library. Initially, his thoughts revolve around his Christian upbringing, and he was familiar with and had accepted the teachings of the church. He surprised himself with his own ignorance regarding any objective historical understanding of how the church had become the institution it is today, and what role the Bible played in this. He already knew that the Old and New Testaments were stories handed down over many years, generations, and even centuries, but was still shocked when he read that there was no first-hand account of the birth, life, or death of Jesus. And I quote here a bit from a distinguished professor, Bart Ehrman, and he's professor of studies at North Carolina University. He's a scholar, and he's published 6 best-selling books. So, and this is a quote from him. He said, "I did my very best to hold on to my faith that the Bible was inspired word of God with no mistakes, and that lasted for about 2 years. I realized that at the time we had over 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and no 2 of them were exactly alike," which is, surprising.
Yeah.
And a quote from Wikipedia from Bart Ehrman, and also another very eminent academic, Robert Eisenman. It's in Wikipedia, and you can get lots of first-hand info. It says, "The Gospels are full of discrepancies, were written decades after Jesus' death by authors who had not witnessed any events in Jesus' life. They go on to say the Gospels were authorized not by eyewitnesses who were contemporary with the events that they narrate, but rather by people who did not know Jesus, see anything he did, or hear anything he taught, and that the authors did not even share a language with Jesus." Mm-hmm. Now, in the story, Carl is quite surprised, and I'm surprised. I don't know what you think about that, Katrina.
Yeah, definitely is a surprise.
It is, because we are taught that these are the words of God, and some religious groups believe every single word is the word of God. The historical evidence says that that's far from the case.
It's more like interpretation, isn't it?
Absolutely. And when you look at the human evolution of Christianity, it spread in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, and people moved in many directions, and the beliefs became increasingly diverse. Stories were retold countless times, some of them verbally, some of them in writing. Some stories have become so embellished as to be ridiculous, robbing them of any credibility. It became clear that they needed one version that everybody could use, and that didn't occur until 397 AD, and there was a committee formed of powerful and moneyed men. That's very important, men. The version eventually became known as the King James Bible, which is the standard one we use today.
Yeah.
Academics believe that the stories selected were more influenced by politics and economics than the search for truth, with more being excluded, called the Apocrypha, than were included. Having accepted the stories that could form the basis of a single Bible, many of the apocryphal stories were banned and destroyed. The Archbishop of Egypt decreed that it was heresy even to read any of these stories. Thousands of these documents were hidden, buried in walls, under the ground, anywhere to keep them safe. Many hundreds of years later, these documents still surface, and in fact, in Timbuktu, there's a big library, and it has a lot of academic researchers, and they receive sometimes only tiny fragments of documents because that's all that's left. And they put these together, and they've been doing this for many, many years. Another interesting thing is the fact that Apocrypha was banned didn't stop the Catholic Church from collecting and hiding Apocrypha themselves. Indeed, under the Vatican building in Rome, piles of with ancient manuscripts and artifacts, of which the Roman Catholic Church concealed their very existence until the last few decades, and they still refuse to allow open scholarship of these important historical documents. I mean, that's really, really interesting. The main point behind all of this is that actually the church as an institution, and I'm talking about Catholicism, Protestants, and it's true of many others, act as worldly organizations. And so many of their actions are not consistent with the belief system that they put out. And they're also extremely protective about resisting any sort of modification to a belief system that they've put out. The power of the church became unassailable, so unassailable that even kings were legitimized by the blessing of the Pope. What better way for any aspiring king to protect himself against worldly assailants than by adopting the concept of the divine right of kings, anointed by God or his representative of honor, the Pope? What better way for the church to be protected than to align itself with the worldly powers of the kings and their armies? King Henry VIII wanted to marry somebody else, and the Pope in Rome would not authorize his divorce. So he then set up his own church, and he then went to Parliament and demanded to be head of the church. As I go on here, the more Karl investigates, the more evidence comes to light of church and state operating hand in glove. Queen Elizabeth is head of state in a constitutional monarchy, as well as supreme governor of the Church of England. Israel does not have a constitution, which is unusual even in the West. If there is no separation between the Jewish church and state, how are the rights of Palestinians protected? And the answer is they're not. Rome has an iron grip on the Catholic Church. Of the 260 plus popes that have ever existed, 88 came from Rome and over 190 were from Italy. Apart from the current pope, the previous non-European pope was appointed in 741 AD. I mean, that's stunning. This is remarkable when you consider that Christianity started in the Middle East and Africa. Remember, the Jews escaped from Egypt. Now we're moving on to what impact does this have on today's society. Once the Bible had been standardized, it was used as a document of control to dictate what people were allowed to think, say, and do. The church determined what sin was, giving those in charge the authority to reward those that conformed and punish those that did not. Indeed, no new work could be published without the permission of the church. Now, an interesting example, most people have not heard of this guy, William Tyndale. The Bible was in Latin, and he wanted to translate it into English. The church was completely against this, and he escaped with his life on many occasions. In 1536, he was convicted of heresy and executed by strangulation and then burned at the stake while still alive. This is amazing. In terms of his impact on our language, interestingly enough, once the book had been published, within 2 years, it became the standard document, and we now the King James Bible. And some people say he had as big an impact on the development of English as Shakespeare. Example, the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven. This is like fight the good fight, or am I my brother's keeper, or the spirit is willing, is weak, or salt of the earth. These are just a few of the phrases that he developed and have been copied by lots of people. So it's very interesting how the Bible was adapted, and they just accepted it when they had no control. Another example is Galileo, who is known as the father of modern science. He built a telescope that proved that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but this was in direct contradiction with the teachings of the church. what happened was he was arrested and tried. And this is, again, a quote from Wikipedia. They're not the only source, but this is just a historical example. The matter was investigated by the Roman Inquisition in 1615, which concluded the idea was foolish, absurd, and heretical, since it contradicted the Holy Scripture. Galileo alienated the Pope, and he was tried by Inquisition, found vehemently suspect of heresy, and forced to recant. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Now that's an example of how the church is very defensive.
Yeah.
The dominance of the church was considerably strengthened by the granting of indulgences to sinners who offered money or land to the church for the forgiveness of sin, thereby enhancing their chances of going to heaven. By the Middle Ages, 1/3 of the land in Western Europe was owned by the church.
Wow.
I mean, that's just incredible.
Yeah.
This institutionalization of religion enabled the gathering of the vast wealth needed to construct the magnificent cathedrals and churches throughout the country, glorifying God while simultaneously demonstrating wealth and bestowing worldly power on those in charge, all divinely blessed. The newly approved Bible was a profound impact on the evolution of Christianity. Some believe that the women contributed more to the development of Christianity than men in the first 200 or 300 years. After that date, after they'd established the King James Bible, women were massively relegated. God was God the Father, Jesus, Son of God, 12 disciples, all men.
Yeah.
Jesus' mother was sanitized as a virgin, and for 1600 years, Mary Magdalene was maligned as a prostitute, which was not corrected by the Pope until 1969, when the fabrication could no longer be sustained. Some historians believe that she was the senior disciple, Jesus' confidant and girlfriend. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that God had a wife, a shearer. Undervaluing the contribution of women is historically inaccurate and still reinforces sexual inequality in the Catholic and Protestant churches today. So that's a big mouthful. Any reaction to that?
No, it's very shocking, but it doesn't surprise me.
No.
That's really sad to say, but it's shocking when you're saying it in the sense of, men having control and these sort of things, but it doesn't surprise me from when you're saying it to me.
I mean, what's the chances of the next Pope, Catholic Pope, being a black African woman? I mean, statistically, 1 in a million?
Yeah, probably less than
ridiculous.
That. Yeah, probably.
You've got lots of Christians in the Philippines and in many, many countries, but Europe and the Catholic Church are absolutely tied together. I mean, some religious groups, as I've said, take every word in the Bible as the word of God, enshrining absolute truths, universal and eternal truths. There always be. But there's nothing that more threatening to an absolute truth than evidence, and there's nothing that has ever been written that has not been written by man, and nothing that cannot be changed or improved. The Bible was not written by God, but man, and contains information based on logic applied to evidence available to man at the time. Many of the assertions in the Bible are wrong, and this means that they made absolute truths and punished many people over many hundreds of years, causing massive suffering. I mean, it's really, really tragic. A general comment, because in the story, Carl examines the evolution of organizations, and the more he looks at it, the more he looks at religion and says it is another worldly organization, not whether God exists or not, because it's unworldly and cannot be proven, but in terms of the way the churches operate, they operate in exactly the same way as a government, a party, any group of individuals.
Yeah.
And I mean that's really fundamental to understand. The creation of the Catholic Church as a powerful organisation spanning the world was the result of tireless efforts and power seekers fueled by ambition, violence and greed. Now that's a quote from Saints and Sinners by the Public Broadcasting Service America. It's a big TV channel, and they do lots of research into lots of activities. And the early popes in particular did a number of things which were horrendous then. They'd be horrendous today.
Wow.
So I mean, this is very sad. The interesting thing is, the church has always been secretive, and it is still very secretive today. And what has opened things up is not the church investigating, it's independent thinkers, social organisations and individuals who've done research and then found facts and then brought them to the attention. When this happens, the church nearly always resist. But if they then get proven incorrect, they just change and carry on as if nothing had changed at all.
Yeah.
One of the sadnesses, the heavy hand of the church on historical explanations has successfully suppressed many aspects of church activities. Such was the power of the church and social norms so pervasive that no one felt able to challenge the institution, which hid widespread abuse, while submissive society rejected the evidence or tolerated the abuse, leaving victims suffering in silence. And there is a wealth of information to actually support that, most of which has come to light in the last few years. An appalling example of an organisation protecting itself was published in a report in 2017 into the many thousands of cases of abuse in Australian institutions from 1950 to 2009.
Yeah.
A stark warning of an exhaustive 5-year investigation by an Australian Royal Commission into institutional child abuse. McClellan singled out the Roman Catholic Church in particular for often putting reputation above the safety of children in what they found to be decades of systemic sexual abuse, a familiar pattern of scandals dogging Catholic institutions globally. That's their quote in their report.
Yeah.
In Pennsylvania, the United States, in August 2000, a grand jury heard that over 300 predator priests had abused over 1,000 children for decades. The report investigated 6 dioceses out of the 8 in the state of Pennsylvania. Only 2 dioceses had similar results from an earlier report. That's 100% of the dioceses from an investigation into only 1 state. In Ireland, the Catholic Church ran the Magdalene laundries, which took in unmarried pregnant women, usually young and desperate, and put them to work in appalling conditions. They were underfed, unpaid, and worked many hours. When the baby was born, the babies were removed. The conditions were so appalling that many babies died and were secretly buried in grounds run by the Roman Catholic Church. The practice lasted for 200 years and only ended in 1996. In August 2018, the Pope visited Ireland to beg forgiveness for decades of abuse perpetrated by members of the Roman Catholic Church. With the Pope standing next to him, Leo Varadkar, the Irish Prime Minister, said, "Brutal crimes perpetrated by people within the Catholic Church and then obscured to protect the institution at the expense of innocent victims. Child sexual abuse, the Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes, and illegal adoptions were stains on church and state." He called for the separation of church and state, where religion no longer is at the centre of society. I mean, there are lots of examples. There's a report that's come out only a couple of weeks ago in France saying that from 1950 to 2020, they think 330,000 children were abused, most of these through the institution of the church.
Wow.
I mean, these are absolutely appalling.
Yeah.
A report by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse examined 38 religious organisations set in England and Wales, including Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, Methodists, Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and nonconformist Christian denominations. And they found either cases of sexual abuse, and very particularly where there were these issues, these were not dealt with properly. And the barriers that went up in the report, and I'm quoting, blaming the victim, sex not being openly discussed, the deference shown to religious figures built a trust that could be exploited to perpetuate abuse. Many organisations were dominated by men.
Yeah.
Mistrust of government bodies and external institutions emanating from fears of religious persecution. The concept of forgiveness can be misused, both to put pressure on victims not to report their abuse and to justify failures of religious leaders. Failure to take effective action where allegations are made. I mean, these are highly disturbing.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is important, though, this is not the core, that importance of what I'm saying. This is not an attack on the churches. This is raising evidence where there is abuse within the organisation, and then the organisation both tolerate and protect the perpetrators of the abuse.
Yeah.
And if we then start to look at organisations in that light, you can then start to look at many institutions. Look at things that have been in the news.
Yeah.
The BBC have had it with the DJ. What was his name?
Yeah, I know who you mean.
Jimmy Savile.
Yeah.
You look at historically how the royal family have behaved. You look at care homes in this country, where and the basic fundamental point is where people are vulnerable, then they can be exploited.
Yeah.
And now we move on to something that's much broader and affects all of us in society. If you look at, say, migrants coming into this country, you look at the exploitation of very poor countries where they work for almost nothing in very dangerous conditions in Africa, in Asia, in South America. These are people who are vulnerable and get exploited.
Yeah.
And what we really need to do is to look at the values that we have and to say, what are the values that we need to live by going forward?
Yeah.
And one of the problems with many British people, people like myself, white local people who've been here for generations, is they don't understand how unequal the world is, and they also don't understand how much they personally need to change their opinions and their actions. I mean, anybody can have, you can believe what you want, you have the freedom.
Yeah.
If you start acting on your beliefs, then you are responsible for your beliefs.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that is absolutely central. And if you look at, say, this country, we have a wealth of delusions and myths which have been carried down where we think we're independent and we can do what we want. Reality is we're completely dependent on the rest of the world.
Yeah.
You've only got to look at the problem in Ukraine at the moment. There's no way that the British could protect the people in the Ukraine. And if without the help of Europe and the Americans, and if we don't protect people around us, eventually we will be in that situation ourselves. And will we have any help that we need at the moment we need it? And that is the absolute central point.
Yeah.
And that is why prisoners of beliefs is extreme, to my mind, it's extremely important in making people look at the evidence and look at their lives and then say, how much do my beliefs support me and the people around me, and how much are they a barrier to me improving the life of myself and people around me, and
Definitely.
that's an absolutely fundamental thing.
Yeah.
I've got loads more to say. I won't say it tonight.
Yeah.
I've got things to say on capitalism, for example, and democracy, and other things like that, all of which is in the book.
That's great. And, you know, before we go, and I want to say thank you again for giving us such a detailed perspective on religion. It's such a... loads of people are commenting saying that they've enjoyed listening to you. Some people have been shocked by some of the things, which has been eye-opening, some of them are saying. How can they get...
I'm shocked.
Definitely. How can people get this book, and how can they go about learning some more?
I'm in the process of getting it published. It will be published very soon. It'll be on a website. It'll be on Amazon. I hope it's in local bookshops, and it will certainly be available at lots of charities in Coventry. It will be widely available. This is my ambition.
That's great, and you know what? I'm rooting for you for it to go far and wide. Definitely.
Thank you very much indeed. No, it's been really good.
Anytime. Have a great rest of the evening, and thank you once again.
Okay, thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye. Yes, people, that was Richard Rowe, and you know, what a blessing it is to speak with him, take his knowledge from what he's been going through, what he's done. It's always a blessing. Right now, we're taking you to a few more tunes, okay? Don't forget, around 7:45, we're going to be playing Poetry Moments, so make sure you keep it locked in. But until then, it's a tune by Ziggy Marley. Take a listen. Here we go.
Yeah. Love is my religion.